Start this video on Maryland, I just want to preface this by saying that this is not going to be me shitting on Maryland and Mike Locksley for the next 10 minutes. I actually happen to be a huge Mike Locksley fan. And I say that because in many ways, he reminds me a lot of Sam Pittman in the sense that he's very charismatic. He's a player's type of coach, a really strong track record in terms of recruiting. And most importantly, just a guy that you want to see freaking win. And I think that's really kind of the big question that we see in 2025 with Mike Locksley. And what got me kind of inspired to really do this segment is his press conference last week, where all things considered, he has shown probably the most vulnerability that I've seen from a power head coach in really quite some time. I mean, you think to yourself, hey, this is a guy who is, pretty much on the ropes in terms of his career as a head coach, because, you go back and, I think to myself, his last stint as a head coach was with New Mexico, and he only won like 3 games. And then before that, I mean, he's had a couple runs as an offensive coordinator. He had a stint in Alabama. He was briefly the interim when Randy Insall got fired. So, I mean, Mike Locksley is a guy that you can tell is a super passionate about this program. And if anybody's going to find a way to make it work, it's going to be Mike Locksley. And when I look at this team last year, it was really difficult to watch in a number of ways, right? Because obviously they missed a lot of the key playmakers that they had back in 2023. Locksley relieved Josh Giddis from his play calling duties last season and took over. And ultimately, it just didn't really end up being the greatest fit, because ultimately there were just a lot of the players that he had now, such as Billy Edwards, for example, who now transferred to Wisconsin. He necessarily wasn't really the best fit for what Locksley and Gaddis were trying to do. And now that he's hired Pip Hamilton, who, at least in my opinion, is a really intriguing hire. And whether you want to talk about whether the XFL counts as, as being a play caller or not, that's one thing. But, I guess I'm curious about, how is he going to utilize either Malik Washington or who will probably be the starter, Justin Martin. But most importantly, I think what I'm really curious about is how much of the RPO is Pep Hamilton going to use, and how much of that NFL influence are we going to see with this Maryland offense, right? Because if you want to talk about them statistically, offensively, in 2023, they were ranked 38th in the country in rushing. And in 2024, they were ranked 85th, which is just such a stark contrast given, the amount of success that they've had in the past couple years too. Because granted, I don't want to put this all on Billy Edwards too. I obviously think Billy Edwards is maybe, obviously not a good fit to some degree. And yes, he definitely struggled at times. Both sides of the ball really, really struggled. I mean, in terms of the PFF grade, I mean, they were both clearly outside of the top 90, both offensively and defensively. And, when you think of the success that Maryland had from 2021 to 2023, for example, one of the funnest things to watch with the Terrapins was just how strong their offense was. I mean, for example, when they failed to get 20 points or more, they typically lost. And it wasn't just that the passing game was shitty. It was that the ground game was rough. The offensive line struggled pretty consistently. And they're only going to have a handful of starters coming back as well. Only, I think, 2 starters, which to me, I think is going to be another serious question mark going for them this year, because I think it is going to take some patience. It's definitely going to take a little bit of just hand-holding, I guess is the way I'll phrase it. And, 2, they also have Rantrell Perry of Central Connecticut State, who is probably one of the best prospects in the entire portal in terms of offensive tackle prospects that I think you can kind of tune and really kind of get the most out of. But it was definitely just kind of a disappointing season for them last year, being 4-8. But I guess when I look at this team, Mike Locksley did a really good job at summarizing this, right? Because he pretty much said, like, I'll read the exact quote since I have it up. "I own the fact that I lost my locker room," Locksley said in an interview with ESPN. "And this is Coach Locks, the locker room king, telling you that this landscape I had to choose between paying young players who were coming in or reward older players who've been through the fire 3 bowl games, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, first and foremost, you got to admit just the vulnerability of that is just incredible too. And it's just going to be so telling this season because although there's a lot of question marks in terms of the roster itself, which I'll get to in a second, at least if you look at it on paper, Maryland does not skip the beat in terms of recruiting. And in the little ticker there, I do emphasize of how well he's done. He's done in Delaware, Virginia, and Maryland in general, which absolutely deserves credit for that, given that's one of definitely just a hotbed in general in terms of recruits. But here, let me just rattle off a couple of recruiting stats just to kind of give everybody here a little bit of context in terms of what Maryland is doing in 2025. So in 2025, they're ranked 32nd recruiting class, which is about 12 points higher than last season, which is 44th. 48% in state. I think that's probably the most incredible stat that I can pull out of here from Maryland's point of view. Half the kids that they got were in state. I mean, I think that's really telling in terms of what they're doing here. And, obviously 21 commits to 16 transfers, just be even in the top 10 in the Big Ten, I think is definitely pretty telling. And, I really am excited about a couple of these kids, right? I talked about Malik Washington, which although I think Justin Martin is going to be starting at a handful of snaps at UCLA and the coaching staff seems to like him, I think you really have to consider starting Malik Washington here as your starter. I think, obviously we're going to see more in fall ball in terms of this quarterback battle, even though Martin seems to be the guy. I would seriously push back and say, I think you really have to give Malik Washington a shot here. I would love to see him get some first team reps and really utilize him because I think he really is a strong running threat. I think he's got a solid arm. It's going to take a little bit for him to kind of develop, perhaps even argue that maybe he should sit back for a year. But I think he is a great fit for what Pip Hamilton and this offensive staff is really trying to do. So keep your eyes on that. And also, I'll give a shout out to Zahir Memphis, who's an edge rusher, 4-star kid from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is where I lived for the past 4 years. So I mean that kid's going to be definitely somebody that to keep your eyes on too. And also, I'll show some love to the 2026 class that Maryland's pulling too, and talking about Zion Ely, who 2026 number one recruit, electric speed, elite combination of athleticism and off the edge, 6'3", 220 prior to his junior season. And really is just a rare breed. He's somebody who has been highly productive over the past couple of years. There's a strong reason why he is the top edge prospect. And quite frankly, it's just incredible to seeing how quick he gets off the ball as well. So look for him as well. And I'm definitely intrigued, and hopefully they do end up keeping him because, he's definitely going to be a guy that they need. But in any event, back to Maryland. So what does Maryland really need to do this year? I guess is kind of the big question, because I think a lot of the attention, and rightfully so, should be on the offensive side of the ball. But here's what they really need to do this year. And before I tell you what they're going to do this year, there's just a couple things that I want to rattle off here. First, what Maryland does have going for them, I just rattled it off about what they don't have going for them aside from recruiting, is they don't have to play Ohio State, Oregon, Iowa, or Penn State. Not having to face those 4 teams is an incredible start. But Locksley has been 16-40 in Big Ten competition during his time at Maryland and has lost 7 games in league play by 10 points or more last season. So it's not just that they're losing, but they're getting spanked. And when you look at, they were near the bottom last year in conference in terms of scoring defense, giving up over 30 points a game, 378 yards on defense, and only 17 takeaways and only a handful of sacks. I mean, I think they only had maybe 14 sacks last year. It was piss poor. I mean, look, worse than the Big Ten, and you definitely have to hope that Zahir Memphis, a true freshman, somebody that they're gonna have to hope that he comes in immediately. But here's what Washington really needs to do this year. Here's what Maryland really has to do this year. What they need to do, first and foremost, is they got to start off 4-0. And I get the Camp Randall game on September 20th is going to be tough, but if you can start off 4-0 going into October 4th versus Washington, and that's why I keep saying Washington, because I see Washington's on their schedule, and that's why I'm about to talk about them. But in any event, their schedule is relatively manageable. And when I look at the schedule, and to know that your toughest game really is going to be November 22nd, Michigan, which, by the way, you're hosting them, so that's a really strong start. But their November schedule is probably where I would probably focus on most because, okay, you host Indiana, you're on the road versus Rutgers, which Rutgers is always going to be a tough team no matter what. I mean, they played Illinois tough really last season, and they're always a pretty solid team. Then you're on the road versus Illinois. I've said it on this show that I think Illinois is going to end up being a playoff team this year. So you take that loss. And then you finish the year off Michigan State. My takeaway from this is if you're Maryland, you need to find a way to win 3 conference games. Plain and simple. If Maryland doesn't find a way to make a bowl game this year, Locksley, it will probably be gone. And do I think Maryland is going to find a way to make it to a bowl game? I think they'll find a way to win at least 5 or 6 games. And the reason why I think that is just because, I talked about it a couple seconds ago about some of the criticisms, obviously, but the good news is at least in terms of offensive weapons, they do have a couple guys. I mean, you do have 5th-year senior Jalil Farouk from Oklahoma. He's probably going to be your number 1 deep threat. You have Caleb Webb, who, a couple years of experience, but not anything too strong. And then you have Dorian Fleming from Georgia State, who will probably just be more or less maybe a number 2 tight end and somebody that you use in a handful of running packages. He had 6 touchdowns last season, so probably just a pretty solid red zone threat. But in conclusion, I mean, when I look at this team, the big questions are obviously, to me, is going to be on the offensive line and the defensive line. How does Justin Martin or Malik Washington, whoever it ends up being, how do they come into their own? Because I think in some way, they do have a really similar skill set. Because we saw a little bit of a hint in Justin Martin when he had his first start versus Penn State. He looked really poised. He looked like he was ready for the moment. And he really utilized his legs. And UCLA, for the most part, I mean, sure, people are going to talk about some of the times in garbage time a little bit. But Justin Martin, I get why they're excited about this kid. So keep your eyes on him. And then Malik Washington, too, who is ranked as the number 11 signal caller in the cycle, highest ranked recruit that they've landed in probably about 3 or 4 years or so. And there's a reason why they like him, too, and why I was impressed with him when I watched the Maryland spring game. 12 for 18 for 168 yards and 2 touchdowns. So keep your eyes on him. But I think it's going to require a lot of patience for them this season, a lot of hand holding, a lot of determination. And if they can put this together and make a bowl game this season, I think that's something that Maryland fans should be excited about. But prepare for an uphill battle, prepare for some difficulties, and prepare for just a lot of moving parts because Maryland has to find a way to get off to a big start, and November is going to be a serious test for them in 2025.